Absence makes the heart grow fonder, and mostly today, everybody feels pretty good about what WCW was. We're sad it died, but we remember Goldberg winning the world title in the Georgia Dome, the reinvention of Sting, the formation of the NWO, or what we now call the happy times. What we try and forget is no DQ matches that ended in a disqualification, Viagra on a pole stipulations, and the finger poke of doom. If you don't know, look it up. This kind of affection wasn't exactly prevalent at the turn of the century, however, as many wrestlers who were actually WCW contracted employees were fed up of being there. Be it a case of being ignored or treated like an idiot, it didn't matter they were working for the biggest wrestling company in the world. For them, it sucked. So with that in mind, I'm Simon from What Culture. Please do hit that subscribe button. This is 10 wrestlers who hated wrestling for WCW. Number 10, Bret Hart. Vince McMahon once told Bret Hart that WCW wouldn't know what to do with him. He was correct. With blame cast all over the place, the real shame is that one of the best of all time was treated like an afterthought in World Championship Wrestling, and it was ridiculous on all levels. When he arrived in 1997 too, the Hitman was undoubtedly the talk of the town. The Montreal Screwjob was terrible, but it did mean a spotlight was on Hart, and all WCW had to do was capitalize on it. They did not. Bret claims it was Eric Bischoff having no real plan, whereas Eazy-E says Hart was so emotionally hurt from it all that it was a downward spiral from that point on. Whatever the truth, his run was not what it should have been, and the excellence of execution did not have a good time there, even more so as a few years after joining, he got kicked in the head by Goldberg and had to retire. This is not fun. Number 9, Ric Flair. When the Nature Boy unleashed on Eric Bischoff during the 14th of September 1998 Nitro, it was said with as much truth as he could muster. Screaming that he didn't care about being fired because I'm already fired, Ric Flair never had a solid relationship with the new WCW hierarchy, who really didn't understand his standing in the business. I mean, he's arguably the best ever, it shouldn't be that hard. This was an ongoing saga though, going back to 1991. When Jim Herd was brought in to run things, he thought so little of Flair he wanted him to cut his hair and start calling himself Spartacus. Rick was so offended he left the company as the world champion and turned up on WWF TV with the actual belt. That does not just happen. The jet-flying son of a gun was back with the competition a few years later, but even then he and Eric Bischoff did not get on. I saw them go to court in 1998 when Flair no-showed a taping to watch his son's wrestling match instead, although Rick claimed he got the green light to do it. That sums WCW up. No one had a clue what was going on. The case was dropped, resulting in the aforementioned line from a returning Flair, but even then, it left Slick Rick a no-confidence mess and took a big WWE comeback before he started to feel like himself again. That doesn't sound very entertaining to me. Number 8, the Radicals. When 4 people jump from one company to the other as a showing of solidarity with how awful they've been treated, you know they can't have been happy. But this is what Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, and Perry Saturn did in the year 2000 without even thinking twice. They were done. There was more proof of this in the sense that Benoit had been given the WCW World title in an attempt to make him stay, but not even that was enough. He was done and just didn't want to be there. His 3 friends agreed. It was all off the back of being told constantly they were too small to be main eventers in WCW, even though they were having the most popular and best matches. It had become boring and repetitive, so they simply left and created quite the stir when they all arrived on Monday Night Raw. There would have been 2 more of these renegades too, if everything had gone to plan, because number 7, Billy Kidman and Shane Douglas. That's right, at one point there was solidarity between 6 WCW wrestlers who had all decided to back each other up and go to pastures new. After Kidman was convinced to stay, likely because he was told that it would still be a struggle in the WWE because he wasn't the biggest of guys, it left Douglas out in the cold. The final 4 Radicals bond got tied to, which was made worse when Vince McMahon decided he didn't want Shane back among his ranks. They had fallen out years prior, and clearly old wounds weren't ready to be healed. Douglas would claim that he was left out in the cold as Guerrero and friends ensured they got the offer they wanted, and the rest is history. Even if this had happened, I'm not sure Shane would have been used as he desired. I mean, last time he was in the WWE, he got presented as a teacher. Just wasn't meant to be. Number 6, Bobby Heenan. Bobby the Brain Heenan never wanted to leave the WWF. Let's make that clear right away. As Vince McMahon likes to do though, when you get to a certain age, he doesn't see the worth in you anymore, even though Heenan still had loads to offer. I mean, he's arguably the greatest manager and co-commentator ever. He didn't want to leave wrestling, so he joined WCW, and from there it was just a bad time for the Brain. The working conditions, described as the inmates running the asylum, irked him no end, and as everybody else stopped caring, he found himself caught up in the negativity. He also fell out with broadcast partner Tony Schiavone, which didn't make for the best television at times. It just wasn't good. Once WCW was dead, Bobby made no qualms about how much he hated it there and how much he would like a return to WWE. While we got that awesome spot at WrestleMania 17, that was about it. It is such a shame. Number 5, Scott Steiner. The real question here is, was Scott Steiner happy anywhere? I would argue maybe not. He's always just seemed so angry. This hit a new beat on the 7th of February 2000 Nitro though, where he was so mad at management and so sick of the madness that halfway through a promo in the ring, he actually encouraged fans to tune into Raw. Okay. Now this was clearly Steiner trying to be too cool for school, thinking the audience would see him as such a renegade and a badass, they would continue watching, even though he was talking about Stone Cold Steve Austin. That didn't really work, and the powers that be were so pissed off he got suspended with pay. Right, I'm sure that really got under his skin, having a rest as money rolled in. Again though, it was more bonkers stuff created in WCW which caused all parties to just want out. What a horror show. Number 4, Mick Foley. Mick Foley as Cactus Jack was great. A character where you genuinely weren't sure what he was going to do. This came to a head when he was permitted to work some dates with ECW. This was done as an attempt for both companies to have a relationship, and everybody thought a match between Jack and Sabu to see who was crazier would get a lot of fans interested. Fortunately for Mick, his decision to turn up with the WCW tag title and throw it to the ground annoyed World Championship Wrestling. What a shock. Declaring it useless compared to becoming the most nuts person in the industry, no one was pleased, even though Foley in his book tried to explain it was just to try and pique interest. Around this time he also admitted to having a serious problem with how he was being used though, and how he had already started to feel like WCW was not going to be the place for him. He was right. Number 3, Paul Heyman. Paulie Dangerously was quite the character in the early 90s. It always felt like he was one step away from bringing WCW down. Behind the scenes, that was kind of the situation too. The full extent of it can't be revealed because the pair went to court, but there's enough out there to suggest that WCW tried to renege on his contract, and that then Booker Bill Watt said some things no one should ever even think about, let alone say out loud. It didn't stop Heyman from revolutionizing wrestling in ECW, and at every opportunity, he would rip into his former employers about how much it sucked to be there. Certainly sound like he had just cause. Number 2, Chris Jericho. Chris Jericho was such a good heel in 1998 that he organically left the cruiserweight division and started to become a far bigger star, even though that's not what WCW wanted. He was so on form he even managed to work himself into a program with Goldberg, which would have been money if Bill himself hadn't crapped all over it. The man with the undefeated streak was told it would ruin his career by doing comedy, even though Jericho was happy to have his ass whooped. That part doesn't really sound very funny to me. The real problem was that this wasn't the plan for the Lionheart, so as often happens in wrestling, the company tried to stop it getting any more momentum, even though that would have helped them and it would have helped their bottom line. Just doesn't make any sense. It also meant when Jericho's contract was due, he decided not to re-sign. He went to the WWF instead. That had always been the dream anyway, and even if they didn't treat him as he wanted, what difference would it have made? As it turned out, he went on to become a multiple-time world champion and one of the best wrestlers ever. Whoops. Number 1, Steve Austin. I mean, who else, right? The rhetoric these days is that WCW were fools for not using Steve Austin more, and while that is true to a certain extent, I don't think anybody could have predicted what was going to happen. You could even say that without his dismissal, his rise to the top may never have occurred. It started when Bischoff supposedly heard Steve mouthing off about the company in the background as he spoke on the phone to Austin's wife. It was during a time where Steve was injured, and the fallout was the future industry leader getting his walking papers in the post. You can imagine how he took that. It all spilled out during a short run in ECW in 1995, where he just tore into his old employer constantly. It was kind of amazing because he meant every word, and we'd never seen this side of the rattlesnake before. It was almost as if a new persona was being formed. Austin would soon go on to win the war for the WWF, and all because he wasn't happy where he was. So always bet on yourself, kids, because you just never know.